SALT has a once a month presentation, and this last month I went to it. Well, in December they had. I guess they have a couple, maybe once a week. I'm not sure. Let's see. They had one previously that was on the 4th, so it looks like once a week. And the one I went to was on the 11th. It was an officer from the Arizona Game and Fish, Laura, was there, and she gave a presentation about the fire and how it burned 124,000 acres, mostly in the Superstition Wilderness area. I was up there the last Saturday, and there is a lot of damage, but it was amazing how many different places got burnt and how many places didn't. And it was incredible. But anyway, the presentation she gave was about the wildlife and how the fire affected the wildlife, and it was a great presentation. I will be posting with this video some of the video, and I apologize because I didn't get all of it because my phone was acting up. But anyway, I'll be posting it on YouTube, and I hope you appreciate that. Also, she tried to do a presentation, and it looked like the computer crashed there. We were at the library, and but it looks like the computer crashed. But she did give us a link. And here's the link here. You can go to SALT, Superstition Area Land Trust website, and I have a link there for the Woodbury Fire. And so I hope you go there and get a chance to look at it. It was incredible, some of the stuff they talked about, and she was talking about the effect of it. Here's the website, and they have some movies, and what they spotted different places, what they spotted white-tailed deer here, and the flyover. She talked a little bit about the flyover. Here's a deer in the middle of a place that hasn't hardly any vegetation. Here's another one of sheep and geez. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this and the part of the video to follow.
First off, how many hunters do I have in the room? About a quarter of you, okay. How many anglers, fishermen do I have in the room? Okay. And then how many do I have in the room that just enjoy wildlife viewing? Everybody, okay, that was a silly question. Anybody that has a conflict with hunting or has concern about its place in conservation or doesn't fully understand that, raise your hands because I'm going to talk about it anyway. Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. I will address that as we go along. So I also want to let you guys know that this presentation was supposed to be about 65 slides. We had a ton of pictures of the post-fire survey, and that presentation has effectively crashed 3 computers over the last 2 days. So I had to start from scratch. And this is not the bulk of the presentation that I wanted to give, but I do still have some immediate post-fire survey photos in here, as well as some recent survey photos that I took just last week. So we'll get going on that. Are there any of you who don't know what a wildlife manager does? Because I won't spend any time on it. Okay, so a wildlife manager, obviously I enforce Arizona Game and Fish statute. I can enforce any other state law across the state of Arizona as well. But I am funded, and my primary focus is enforcing Title 17, which is the wildlife and fishing laws, as well as Title 28 off-highway vehicle laws, and then the boating safety. So you can find me patrolling hunts, patrolling the lakes for fishing as well as safety, and then patrolling just the desert for off-highway vehicle safety and user fee requirements. So that's the law enforcement side. Then the other side, which is another huge bulk of my job, is the wildlife management. So what that looks like is annual surveys for all of the different game species, to know what's going on in the landscape. We use those surveys to set our hunting permit requirements and limits for the year. It's pretty complicated, but that's the long and short of it. So we really rely on our surveys. We're going to survey this year for deer, an aerial survey. We're on a biannual. We only survey every 2 years right now, aerial surveys, and then in the off years we survey the ground. So I'm really looking forward to getting in the air and doing some concentrated focus helicopter surveys for deer and javelina in January because of the fire. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about, because it does relate to my job, I'm like looking for a mouse to move this thing, and I realized that I have to push the screen. I'll come back to this. This is a story map that was made by our game biologist. Has anybody accessed the Game and Fish Department website and seen that story map? No? It's really great. So I'll make a point to save some time to come back to that, because there's some footage of the helicopter flights with some actual video that's really good. This is just our mission. We have a really diverse mission. We have a lot of people who work for us, from biologists to wildlife managers to education specialists, but essentially all of us collectively work to ensure that there's a wildlife resource for future generations. At about 7:30, I'm going to get used to how this works. I kind of already went over this, and this, for those of you who don't know, I'm going to continue to refer to it as 24B just because that's the lingo I'm used to. So this is Game Management Unit. Oh, geez. Charlie said it was sensitive. He was right. This is Game Management Unit 24B. It's a big area. It's approximately 497,000 acres. It's a lot to cover. So the first thing I want to talk about a little bit, because we're going to talk about hunting and game management because they go hand in hand. What basically funds wildlife conservation is hunting, and that all started back in the mid-1800s with the North American model for wildlife conservation. And essentially that was hunters who saw that there was a problem, that animal resources, wildlife resources were being depleted. For instance, the passenger pigeon was hunted to extinction. So these are the principles of that North American model for wildlife conservation. The first one, and I'm going to breeze through these, essentially wildlife's held in the public trust. It is all of our wildlife. It is not the Game and Fish Department's wildlife. It is everyone's wildlife to enjoy, whether you enjoy it by taking photos of it or you actually go out and hunt and harvest and bring home meat to eat. The next one is prohibition of commerce of dead wildlife. So sale of wildlife parts is prohibited. You can donate game meat that you've harvested, but you cannot sell it. Then democratic rule of law. Essentially, the public process is what we use to set our laws. We base what we do off of science, which is one of the, number 7. So we base what we do off of science, but it's also a part of the public process. So we constantly have meetings where the public are invited to give their input on our management strategies and our rules. Number 4 is just that there's a hunting opportunity for everybody. Everybody has the right to use the resource as long as they're doing so in a safe and legal manner. And then non-frivolous use, essentially what this one is just that you can go out and you can hunt and you can utilize the resource in an ethical and a sustainable manner. But the frivolous take for just head hunting, shed hunting, things like that, people who go out and kill an animal just for the antlers, that's what this attempts to avoid. And then the international resources, essentially they realize that it's not just a state by state or a country by country, because there's migratory wildlife. So the Vibratory Bird Treaty Act came out that protects birds that migrate. I mean, we have tons of birds that migrate through Arizona, go down to Mexico and up to Canada every year. And we already discussed the scientific management, and that's where my role comes in on the biology side. Is all of us wildlife managers have to have a degree in wildlife conservation and management, or some form of biology that's pertinent so that we can manage using scientifically sound principles, and we're not just issuing permits to hunters because we have hunters wanting more permits, essentially. That's kind of the short way of saying that. So I wanted to explain a little bit more about why hunting is conservation. hunting licenses and tags for specific game animals are what actually go back into pools of money to fund conservation for wildlife. So a lot of people think it seems like a complete oxymoron, and it does. If you just say killing animals saves animals, what? It does, because the funds and the generation of interest between the user groups, whether that's the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation or the Mule Deer Foundation, all of those entities together work with the respective state agencies to pool those resources that come from hunting, fishing licenses, as well as taxes. As you'll see in here, I'm not going to read this, I just put this up, and I don't know if you guys can even see it. It's really small, sorry about that. It just talks about the millions of dollars that are generated by hunting and fishing. And not all of those go right back into our industry. They just go back into the industry, but most of it, yes, it goes back into conservation efforts. So what we're seeing is that species, game species, which when I say game species, it's deer, elk, turkeys, things that can be harvested. Non-game species would be burrowing owls, desert tortoises, Gila monsters. Those are critters that are on the landscape but are not hunted or fished for. So what we're seeing across the country is that game species are coming back. Their populations are doing great. We've had species that were really doing very poorly, and through time and conservation efforts between state entities and nonprofit organizations, we've seen those species really take off and have sustainable populations, where the species that are not harvested and don't have necessarily for lack of a better word, a price tag associated with them, we're seeing those species decline because we don't have the funding to manage them. So that's where harvesting wildlife, hunting wildlife is conservation of wildlife. I know it still seems kind of like an oxymoron, but I hope that clarifies some for those of you that don't know where our funding comes from. Yes?
When I'm hiking, every once in a while I'll see cattle. How does that fit into your portfolio and in some places?
That's a tough question.
That's okay.
No, that's okay. There is a place for livestock management and grazing, and the Forest Service is really good about monitoring the grazing allotments to ensure that there's not an overuse. The term overgrazing gets thrown around a lot, but overgrazing is actually when a range has been used to the point that it's no longer good for the livestock or wildlife. Overuse is less egregious in that there's some damage to the plants, but it's not irreversible. We don't have a ton of that because the Forest Service does a really good job of monitoring their allotments, but the way that works with us is sometimes very mutually beneficial, because we work with the ranchers and the livestock stakeholders to put waters on the landscape, and they maintain those waters in partnership with us, depending on where the dollars come from to fund those waters. So the waters that they're putting out there for cattle benefit wildlife. So it's kind of mutually beneficial. Is that what you were looking for?
I didn't know. Some people say you can't do this, you can't track vehicles. Just was trying to figure out what the truth is. So you covered it.
Yep. There are grazing permittees all over the state. Yep. Yes, sir.
What is the status of the sheep that you placed in the Goldfield Mountains 6 or 8 months ago?
They seem to be doing fine. Some of them have moved around, but they're still in there. Yep, we're seeing them use the habitat. So
Have they moved north towards the lake?
the last telemetry, or not telemetry, but the last GPS collar stuff that I saw, they had moved north a little bit, but I don't know that they've actually gone all the way down to the lake and mixed with the population that's already at the lake. I don't know that that's occurred. So I think I've probably beat this enough, so we're going to move on from that. If anybody has questions about that, it can be a contentious topic and it can be really confusing, but I'm happy to answer questions at the end if anybody has questions about that. Don't be shy, because it's important to understand how it all works. So moving into the fire, like I said before, I was on maternity leave when this happened, so most of this is information that I've assimilated since I've been back. I didn't get to see this firsthand, but as you know from these presentations that you've already seen, it was a huge fire, but all in all, the survey flights that we did afterward show that it to be a beneficial fire for wildlife in the long run. Obviously, the area that burned in the Sonoran Desert, that's not always good in some of those areas because the Sonoran Desert is not evolved to handle fire. So for instance, saguaros, when their skin gets blistered, they can't do what they need to do to assimilate water and use, I don't know that much about saguaros, I just know that when the skin gets blistered, they're gonna die. So it's not good in the Sonoran Desert, but the chaparral and the madril forest that we see, and the pines that didn't get touched, that's all very, very good. And what you probably have heard is that the fire burned in a mosaic pattern. Most wildfires do burn in a mosaic pattern, and what that does is provides different levels of successional stages across the landscape for the wildlife. We'll get into that a little bit more, but what we're seeing so far is that it's going to be very beneficial in the long run for wildlife. These are just some maps that I wanted to show you guys. You've probably seen all of this stuff already. So if you have, I apologize, but essentially this is just showing how the fire moved, how many acres a day burned. The Forest Service is really good. Whoa.
Don't worry about it.
NCWeb is a website that we rely on very heavily to keep track of what's going on with wildfires. I checked that a few times while I was on leave, but you're not supposed to work while you're on maternity leave, so I had to be careful with that. I'm gonna breeze through this because I think Mary probably talked a lot about this. This essentially just shows the burn severity of the soils. What you're seeing here is that the high burn severity for the soils is in orange, which as you can tell, there's very minimal high burn severity. You'll see a lot of low soil burn severity and a medium amount of moderate, and then some good chunks of unburned or very low. So that's what I was talking about the mosaic pattern of how the fire burned. And what that means for the low severity is it didn't penetrate deep into the soil, so the soils will recover quicker. Oh, dang it. So this is the meat and potatoes of what I want to talk about. This is the survey that they did, to my chagrin, while I was still on maternity leave. I found out through Facebook that they did this survey. I wasn't very excited that I missed it. First off, because it's my unit and I really wanted to see what had occurred out there, but also because I love flying helicopters, and so I missed 4 days of helicopter flights. But what they did is they did like we normally do when we're flying any sort of wildlife survey, and they ran a grid pattern. And in this grid pattern, I believe they set the transects. Excuse me, transects are essentially just each pass at a mile wide. And they fly low enough that they can classify wildlife. And every flight, there was one person that was kind of designated to just really look hard for carcasses, for wildlife carcasses, and they didn't locate any carcasses. That's not to say that there weren't any, but they didn't locate any, so that was a good sign. That made us happy. And with the way the fire burned, and the fact that all of these species evolved with fire, more than likely they almost all got out. The only species that we were truly concerned about, and it's yet to be seen come January when we do our surveys, are javelina, because javelina have really poor eyesight. So it's possible that there were some mortalities that we didn't observe with respect to javelina. But as you can see, when they did the post-fire survey, they saw plenty of wildlife. I want to say 9 bighorn sheep. They didn't do a ton of surveying in bighorn sheep habitat because there wasn't a ton of bighorn sheep habitat that burned. So the bighorn sheep that they saw were just incidental to the area that they were already going to fly. It was not a focused sheep survey. If it were, they would have seen significantly more. They saw 81 white-tailed deer, 1 mule deer, 40 javelina, and 1 black bear. The black bear was already back in the burn scar just a week after the fire. And many of the whitetail were as well. So that was promising. They were already seeing green up within the burn scar about a week after the fire. kind of a skinny bear, but there he is. And this I just put in here so that you all could see what our surveys look like. So this is what I meant by the targeted and focused bighorn sheep surveys. We contour, whereas for deer and javelina surveys, we do what I mentioned as being transects. And with sheep surveys, we contour, so the pilot actually flies with the contours of whatever structure we're flying around. So if you have a tendency towards nausea, these flights will make you very sick. The deer flight's not as much because you're flying in transects. It's just that when you locate wildlife and you circle on them, sometimes that makes people sick as well. But so this is just an example of what our surveys usually look like, with actual locations where we've seen wildlife on surveys, with overlay of the unit itself, 24B, and then the red line being the fire, and then everything that's hash marked inside is the fire. Excuse me, we'll get into pictures a little bit now. And did you guys get just inundated with pictures of the fire from all of the other presenters? Yeah? No? Okay, good. Well, hopefully you'll see something new. And like I said, since I was not on these flights, I can't give you locations of where these specific spots were. I can on some of the flights photos that I took, but essentially this is just showing how black the burn scar was in certain areas, and how this was a high vegetation burn. As you can see, the vegetation severity in this burn was pretty severe. And what fire does is it runs uphill, so in canyons like this, and this is good sheep habitat. So I did mention that there wasn't a lot of sheep habitat that burned. There was some, but we noticed that the sheep got out. That's just kind of to show you how black and charred all that was. A creek, so we were happy to see some of our primary drainages didn't burn at all. And as you can see on this one, we've got fire on one side and not on the other. So this creek with the water runoff is gonna have some serious erosion issues coming from this side, but there's still stabilized soil on the other side, so that'll kind of mitigate some of it. Here's a decent picture of what I was talking about the mosaic. So what happens in a picture like this is the areas that didn't burn, let me back up a little bit. What you'll see in some of these pictures, if you had a legend, was that the north slopes are going to burn worse because they're more heavily vegetated, because they're on the north side. The south-facing slopes are less vegetated, and you'll see more wildlife on the north-facing slopes. Wildlife in Arizona don't like to be in the sun. They're constantly trying to regulate their body temperature, so they'll be found on the north slopes, and that's also where the vegetation is. So more than likely, this is a northern-facing slope, and this is a southern-facing slope. I can't tell you that conclusively, and not every single area in the unit burned with that, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb. So what will happen here is that all of this stuff will start to re-veg, and the vegetation will have a higher nutrient content than this older vegetation. So what happens is that different animals use these different vegetative species, these different browse and forbs species at different times of the regeneration process. So they may use some of this for cover, but then they're going to come over here and they're going to find high nutrient packed fresh vegetation growing. So when I say that this is going to be beneficial for wildlife in the long run, that's what I'm talking about. We've seen in the unit that comes to mind is Unit 33, and that's down south. What happened after a large fire, I want to say it was like 76,000 acres down there. I can't even remember the name of the fire right now, but they had a huge uptick in their whitetail population. Excuse me, after the fire. If you don't know, we have whitetail deer, eastern whitetail or back east, they're the really big ones. We have smaller whitetail deer here called the coos or cows deer, and then we also have mule deer. So most of the fire burned in whitetail in coos habitat. That said, it's kind of complicated because the whitetail habitat is now what used to somewhat be historical mule deer habitat, and they've kind of flip-flopped within the unit. Our unit is seeing some decline in the mule deer population, and that's one of the interesting things about this fire that we're trying to determine. We've had a preliminary meeting with our research team within the Game and Fish Department and my game specialist and myself. We're even potentially going to bring on the former game management unit wildlife manager for this area, because he has 20 years or more of experience in the unit, as well as the Forest Service, to see what we can do to kind of capitalize on this landscape level change that this fire has caused, to see if we can learn more about deer movement and habitat utilization and selection after a fire, or if there's something to be learned about how javelina recover after a fire. We've done studies on bear, we've done studies on deer, so it's a pretty interesting place to be in as the new wildlife manager for the unit, because there's a lot of possibilities for learning with this fire. A lot of people were concerned about Revis. Most of all of you have probably heard now that Revis Ranch pulled through. Just another good picture to show the mosaic burn of the fire. That's a poor quality picture. And then just a picture of sheep. I don't know if you can see them. A couple ewes, young ram. So this is a picture of the Apache Trail on Fish Creek Hill. So I put this in here just for the talking point, because there's been a lot of frustration that the trail is closed, and not everybody has seen the devastation that occurred after the first nasty monsoons that we got after the fire. This is the devastation. I have a picture of an officer standing right here. I didn't want to use his picture without his permission. But this boulder is taller than him. This is about the size of a sedan, maybe a crossover SUV, Ford Escape, something like that. And that's on Fish Creek Hill. So the ADOT is looking at tens of millions of dollars worth of repairs to the highway. So it's going to be a long time before the trail is reopened, if ever. And ADOT is working with the Forest Service, and they're making their recommendation to keep it closed right now based off of the bear report, which you all heard from the team. I think Mike was the team lead for the bear, wasn't he? Yep. So Mike Martinez talked about all of that. He probably addressed that. So I'm just kind of glazing over a lot of this stuff, because I know you've heard most of it. But that's some of the damage that they're looking at. It's pretty significant. Funny story about this. So I didn't take this picture, my boss did. And she went down there with the other officer who was in the picture with this, and they went down there with ADOT. And we do a lot of off-road driving as wildlife managers, a lot. So we get pretty proficient with using four-wheel drive and driving in some nasty situations. Most all of us get stuck if we're doing our job and we're pushing it and trying to find the hard to reach places in our units. Well, they drove down there with ADOT. I think an ADOT truck drove down, and then our guys drove their truck down. And if you've ever been on Fish Creek Hill, you know it's a little bit sketchy. So the ADOT guys couldn't figure out how to get out. They're like, do we back out? Do we turn around? So one of our game and fish officers was like, I'll turn your truck around. So our game and fish officer got in their truck and did like a 15-point turn, turned them around and got them out of there. But the skills you attain as a wildlife manager that you never think you'd use. So
Can I
this
ask you a
is
question on that, please?
sure.
What have you heard, if anything, on discussions that I've heard about converting the Apache Trail that's closed into a non-vehicular path where vehicular traffic will not be permitted to use that trail again?
Right now, I've heard probably about as much as you've heard. That did come from Maricopa County Sheriff's deputy that told me that in discussions with an ADOT supervisor, but I think that those were just discussions. I don't know that there's been any solid information come out on that, and I hate to do it, but I am. If there's a person in the audience who knows more about all of this stuff than I do, so I'm a little nervous speaking in front of this person, but if this person knows the answer to that, maybe we can meet afterwards and give you the answer.
Okay, thank you.
So this is a picture of State Route 88. This is a picture that I took during my survey flight a week ago. Now I want to preface what my survey flight was. It was not an actual wildlife survey flight. So I was not in a helicopter surveying wildlife, so I don't have a whole lot of new great information about observations. I was just in a fixed wing plane, getting above the fire to see what the fire looked like with my own eyes for the first time. But I did take some pictures that kind of show, this is a pretty good example of what it looks like on a side where there was burn and what it looks like on a side where there was not burn. But if you look closely, there's a lot of green up happening on the burn side already.
Question,
Sure.
was it firefighting that stopped the fire at the trail there, or was it kind of
So,
natural?
on
Was
this
that a
one?
good enough fire break to?
On this one, most of this, I believe right here is backburn because they were protecting this value at risk right here, this ranch.
Okay.
So backburn is controlled, it's not usually gonna be as high a severity as the stuff that takes off and just runs. This is another post monsoon picture that I took last week, and in the pictures that they took a week after the fire, you didn't really get a feel for what the water runoff was going to look like because it had lightly rained. It had done a very nice rain, and then the rains that we've gotten since were pretty harsh, pretty severe, caused a lot of flooding. If you lived in Mesa, East Mesa, you saw that with your own eyes. But you can see here these runoffs that are coming down the hill. I don't know if you can actually, I can see them, but it's not that great a quality of a photo. It just shows you how the soil completely loses its ability to hold water. The fire actually creates a layer that's water repellent. So not only does the soil lose its ability to hold water, it repels water after the fire goes over it. But you can see if you look on this far mountain, and I think we're over by Roosevelt here. I can't remember which mountain that is. Anyway, you can see quite a bit of green up happening right over here already. Oh wow, that's it. Okay, good. We have a little bit of time to go back to that story map that I told you about.
Can we get down to Tortilla Flats?
The road is closed at Tortilla Flat. Yep, and it had been until 2-3 weeks ago you were able to access Apache Lake from the east side, and that got closed prior to the most recent storm that we had. So now all you can access is up to Tortilla Flat on State Route 88. So you can get to Canyon Lake, but you can no longer get to Apache Lake. And the marina did close about 3 weeks ago, a month ago, something like that. Don't you hope that the person who started this fire just feels like the world's biggest turd, you know?
So it wasn't a lightning strike?
No, it was, the cause of the fire was never conclusively determined, whether it was target shooting or a cigarette butt or a campfire. That was never determined, but it was determined to be human caused.
Do we know exactly where it started?
At Woodbury, essentially the Woodbury trailhead, which is right there at the wilderness boundary.
Okay.
What was the date? June 7th, I believe is when it started. Yes, ma'am.
So you mentioned there were 81 white male and 1 mule deer in that survey. Do you have any idea what it was before the fire?
So I can't give you the population estimate off the top of my head, but what they saw was that the deer were already moving back into the burn, and I got information from various mines across 24B, across the unit, that they had a ton of deer in the mines during the fire. So, like I said, these wildlife evolved and instinctively know how to move away from the fire. Historic research shows that this habitat evolved with fire burning across it. Now, because of fire suppression and the different land uses, we have a buildup of fine fuels. So I'm trying to think of an area that has a ton of fuel that could maybe use a little bit of burn. Are y'all familiar as you're going east on Highway 60 towards Globe where Oak Flat is?
Yeah.
So if you look on the north side of the highway, there's just a ton of real thick vegetation in that area. You'll find just manzanita all over the place. Manzanita is a woody shrub that doesn't provide a ton of value to wildlife. You'll see them eat the berries, but the woody part, the browse part of the plant doesn't provide a whole lot of nutritional value to wildlife, deer especially. That stuff would be thinned out. It wouldn't be quite so thick. And the grasses, even the native grasses, we have invasive grasses, and that's one of the concerns right now is that the invasives are going to be bolstered after this fire. But all of those fuels were kept in check by the natural progression of fire across time. And with that, the wildlife learned how to get out. So to answer your question, as of right now, we don't know that the fire has had a detrimental effect on the population. We don't think that it has, and in the long run, it'll be a really good thing because, like I said, there'll be all this different successional stages of plants that the wildlife really, really benefit from. Which is why in certain places across the state, you'll see prescribed burning to help with the landscape level fires and keeping the fuel levels down.
Have you seen any fawns at all during your flights?
So the flight that I flew, I was really high.
But I mean, on the earlier flights, any fawns?
You know, they didn't, I don't know if they classified because what I'm seeing doesn't show fawns.
How about animals like tortoise?
So the smaller wildlife, you have to imagine that there's going to be some mortalities because they can't move as fast. They can't get out of there. The wildlife that can go below ground in areas where the severity of the burn wasn't so intense probably did okay. But I have a feeling that slow movers like that, there's some mortalities on the ground that we just haven't seen.
So at a high level for the fish, I mean, they're in the water, but is erosion or damming and things, what kind of impact was there on?
Absolutely, and I apologize, my brain is on game species, but you're right, there's other species out there. There's the non-game and the fisheries. So we've had some, when they did the post-fire surveys, they had our fisheries crew with them, and they looked at the drainages in the creeks, and they've since gone out and even surveyed some of them because we have some native fishes, Gila top minnow, in some of these creeks out here. And in some areas, the fire did us a favor because there were invasive fish in the creeks. And in some areas, it didn't. We know that one of the populations of Gila top minnow has probably been depleted because what happens, like you were alluding to, is that the sedimentation that fills up the creeks, it may completely get rid of some intermittent pools that certain fisheries were relying on. In other areas, it's going to change the acidity or alkalinity of the water and make it not viable water for the fish to survive in. So there's a lot of research and projects going on in the unit with that, so we'll continue that work. And like I said, in one of the areas it was really good because it's going to get rid of the green sunfish that were in there that we didn't want in there in the first place. I feel like there was another hand up a minute ago. No? Okay. Oh no.
There it goes.
I'm going to buzz through this because we've only got 10 more minutes, but I'm really not going to allow time to read the literature in this because it's all stuff you've already heard and that I've already talked about, but the pictures and videos are good if it'll load.
Working on it.
Yes.
So quality of the water, acidic or alkaline, is that affecting the wildlife out there in the creeks?
Yes, so depending on the species, they require, so if it's fish and say amphibians, they are going to require a certain pH and alkalinity to survive in that body of water. And the immediate sediment flows are going to affect that because of the ash. And then over time, that's going to normalize some, but you're still going to be seeing extra sediment, so extra sand and stuff that fills in the creeks that may not even have water on them anymore because they're so filled in.
And the deer and the horses,
So there,
in that water?
there aren't, oh man, it's not gonna work. You know, that's a good question about the deer drinking it. I don't know that we have noted or that research has shown any issues with that. we see some other land uses that cause issues with wildlife drinking the water, but I don't believe that the flooding causes an issue for that. If anybody knows otherwise, correct me please, but I don't know that it does. And there are no wild feral horses in 24B, so that's not an issue. I don't think we're going to get this to load, but essentially this was just more pictures of what I had already shown you in the PowerPoint anyway. Yes, sir?
I took a trail.
If they've lost it all, it's going to eventually be a mortality for that species. Yeah.
So now we got more chances of fire.
Right, it dries that out, but because the fire has burned the fine fuels on the ground, that it's kind of a